Title: The Bone. Last Witness. Year: 195,133. Era: Early Awakening. Author: Jeremy Levan. And Rise of the Zodiac Series, 2025. Chapter 1. The city of Fix was built in circles, each one tighter than the last, spiraling inward to the core, a fortress that held the government, the archives, and the secrets no one dared ask about. For centuries, the outer rings simmered in unrest while the core claimed peace. To enter the core without a permit was death. The question of the core was madness. And yet the dream weaver did both. She arrived in the ash ring, draped in worn fabrics, stitched with symbols from a language the guards could not read. With her came whispers of dreams turned maps, of truths encoded in nightmares, of the old gods muttering beneath the streetlights. At the same hour, in a courtroom deep in the core, a prisoner named Levan was being sentenced. His crime was perception without permission. He had seen too much. They called him the bone-ashed witness, because when he refused to look away from the violence committed in the name of order, they punished his spine until it bent, but it never broke. And when the weaver's arrival reached his cell, he smiled. "I've come," he whispered, "to unmake the spiral." Chapter 2. The Weaver's Dream. Nav led her to the library of revisions of Black Obelisk, where history was written nightly. Posing as a translator, she deciphered erased truths and fed them into the city's whisper threads, a hidden broadcast net that only the disillusioned could hear. Meanwhile, Levan was moved to the procession halls, where condemned thoughts were turned into public warnings. Each prisoner had to walk the mirror path, confessing crimes as the walls reflected their worst moments back at them. But Levan didn't break. He spoke the truth, and the mirrors shattered. From the fragments rose memories not just of him, but of every silent citizen before him. The city trembled. Officials called for emergency containment. The weaver intercepted the command node and rerouted the core's defenses to loop endlessly through mock security drills. In that chaos, she entered the tribunal tower, and there, in the hall of silence, she found Levan, kneeling but unbroken. She offered her hand. "What you seek," she said, "lies at the altar of what you fear." And he rose. Chapter 3. Together, they walked the spiral in reverse. Each ring they crossed brought new revelations. Messages appeared on monuments. Statues wept ink. The people woke not with rage, but with recognition. Conflict spread, not as riot, but as reckoning. In the core, the elders initiated Protocol Zero, an erasure sequence to wipe the city's collective memory. The weaver countered with dreams. She released a resonance pulse through the streets, a wave of visions where every citizen saw who they truly were and what had been done in their name. Some ran, some knelt, but most stood, and the core crumbled not in flames, but in forgiveness. Levan did not take power. He walked beyond the final ring, spine straight, to rebuild where the spiral ended. The dream weaver vanished, her map complete. Only her voice remained, etched into the city's heart. What you seek lies at the altar of what you fear, and in Fix fear no longer ruled, because truth had come home. Title: The Language Shaper. Year: 195,512,820.2. Era: Early Awakening. Author: Jeremy Levan. And Rise of the Zodiac Series, 2025. Chapter 1. When the people of Grellhaven spoke of the Whisper Hollows, they did so in half-sentences and lowered voices. The hollow was a mine that had collapsed decades ago, taking with it over 100 souls, miners, scholars, even children. Their names were etched into stone, but none were ever recovered. They said you could still hear them, now screaming, whispering, and into the silence walked the shepherd of regret. He arrived with a lantern of salt glass, a staff etched with runes of remembrance, and a voice barely louder than breath. He did not promise salvation. He promised listening. He was not alone. Trailing behind him was the language shaper, once a revered speech crafter who had vanished after a scandal involving forged confessions. Her tongue had been bound by choice, but her presence bent the air like a storm gathering meaning. They descended into the hollows together, looking not for the living, but for the truth. Chapter 2. Below ground, the rules changed. Words echoed as thoughts, and thoughts as footsteps. The shepherd called names, not from records, but from guilt those unspoken by families who'd chosen not to grieve. The language shaper wove these fragments into glyphs, tracing them across collapsed beams and shattered helmets. The mine responded, walls groaned open, pathways reformed, but so did the voices. Some came seeking peace, others wanted to be heard too long. They encountered a chorus of whispering remnants, race built of memory and unfinished stories. These souls weren't violent, but they clung, eating their last words were written properly. Each demanded to be listened to fully, and each tale carried shame. The shepherd wept, not for fear, but because every story had been preventable. Failure, woven too tightly into silence, had calcified into something else. Regret. Chapter 3. As they neared the mine's heart, The race thickened. One, a boy named Corn, refused to pass on. He had tried to warn the town of the mine's instability. He had been mocked, ignored, his last words twisted into a joke. The shepherd knelt before him, repeating Corn's true message. The language, Gaber shaped it into a cry of clarity, projected through her silence like thunder. Above ground, bells rang in towers long abandoned. People came, not to watch, but to remember. The shepherd and the shaper emerged with a single stone carved in new symbols, each one a name restored, a truth spoken. The mine did not collapse again. It exhaled. Today the whisper hollows are a monument not to death, but to listening. Visitors leave behind notes, not prayers, not apologies, just words never spoken aloud. Above the entrance, etched in salt glass, listening deeply can unchain more souls than the kindest words. And every dusk the shepherd returns, not to guide the dead, but to help the living remember how to hear. Tidal, the light between footsteps. Year 195,192,307.4. Era, Early Awakening. Author Jeremy Levan and Rise of the Zodiac, Series 2025. Chapter 1. In the settlement of Helprin Fold, names were more than identifiers, they were pacts. Each citizen wore their vow openly, etched onto a strip of linen tied around the wrist. Some read steadfast listener, others bridge builder or truth seeker. Rin's vow was different. He wore no linen. He was the walking vow, his name a paradox, one who carried a promise too broad to define. Most assumed it was arrogance, others assumed exile, but Rin had chosen silence, not from pride, but from failure. Years ago, he had borne the vow of unifier, and in trying to unite two clashing sects, he had caused their final split. Since then, he walked not to lead, but to listen. One spring morning, he arrived in Helprin Fold during their festival of difference. The celebration was quiet, more like a vigil than a party. They gathered in circles, shared mismatched meals, read opposing poetry aloud, and among them sat Myra, the blind healer. She touched no tools. Her hands hovered, her ears searched. She turned toward Rin as he passed. "You carry a wound mistaken for purpose," she said. He paused. "You fear repeating your past." He nodded. "What you fear owns you," she whispered. "What you face bows to you." He sat beside her and stayed. Chapter 2. Helprin Fold was a sanctuary for opposites. A baker who hated yeast worked beside a sourdough master. A painter who feared color collaborated with a sculptor obsessed with shades. Differences weren't tolerated here. They were cultivated. The trouble began when an outsider named Warwick arrived, an ex-commander from the Gray Zones, seeking refuge. His vow was peace through structure. His presence challenged the fluid harmony of the fold. Mara welcomed him. Others bristled. Rin, watch. In council voices rose. Accusations flew. The festival faltered. Rin wanted to intervene, but the fear returned. What if he broke what had begun to heal? Mara spoke privately to him that evening, as they traced the river's path in silence. "You still believe unity means agreement," she said. He exhaled. "Doesn't it?" "No," she replied. "Unity means movement in rhythm, not in step." That night, Rin tied a strip of linen around his wrist. It read, "Witness without fear." And in the morning he spoke, not to convince, but to listen. Chapter 3. Rin approached Varric not with defense, but with curiosity. They walked the garden paths together. Rin asked questions about the Gray Zones, about Varric's lost command, about what peace meant to someone raised on control. Varric began to soften. He admitted his vow was born of trauma, not insight, that his structure had once been armor. "I wanted peace," he said. "I didn't know how to live inside it." The fold began integrating his voice, not by silencing others, but by expanding the circle. Workshops merged, structured rituals met free-form chants. Schedules began including improvisation blocks. Harmony through contrast. Community, not in sameness, but in synthesis. Mara gathered the villagers and ran her fingers across their palms. "You've begun to hear each other," she said. "And that means you've begun to heal." Rin untied his linen and replaced it with a new one. It read, "Bridge of Many Colors." And as he left Helprin Fold once more, the people followed not to leave, but to learn how to walk between differences with open hands. The vow walked on, and the light between footsteps remained. Title: The Bloomwalker. Year: 194,871,794.5. Era: Early Awakening. Author Jeremy Levan and Rise of the Zodiac, Series 2025. Chapter 1. The village of Nimblehook had a peculiar rule. Every building must be no taller than a cow, no wider than a wagon, and no door larger than a stubborn goat. This, they said, kept ambition at bay and egos trim. No one enforced this rule more strictly than Jennifer, the exile's comfort, once Spanish, for designing a chair so magnificent that it inspired 5 people to abandon their jobs and become poets. He returned only after promising to do nothing useful. He opened a shop that offered comfort to the ostracized. Hand-knit cloaks for those who had been shamed, warm soup for misunderstood children, and advice like, "Maybe being weird is just being honest in public." People scoffed, then secretly visited, and when spring came early, bringing wildflowers that bloomed in profane sheets and glowed under gossip, Gandalf calmly put on his apron and welcomed the chaos, because with the flowers came a bloomwalker, the barefoot girl trailing petals in sarcasm, and doors started behaving strangely. Chapter 2. It began with the mayor's pantry door, which refused to open unless someone complimented their rival. Then the bakery's entrance shrank until only children could squeeze through. Finally, the school's front door spun in place until the teacher recited a joke. Gandalf chuckled. The bloomwalker's pranks. He didn't say how he knew her, but he left her chamomile tea at dawn, and she left him a single, impossibly folded leaf in return. The villagers were annoyed, then curious, then quietly delighted. They had to work together to solve their own entrances. Arguments turned into group riddles. Feuds dissolved after shared giggles at the butcher's door, which insisted on hearing to knock jokes before swinging open. Still, one house remained untouched. Gandalf's. Its door stayed stubborn, ordinary, until one night when the bloomwalker stood before it and asked, "Why do you pretend you're not lonely?" And the door opened inward. Chapter 3. Gandalf disappeared for 3 days. When he returned, he didn't speak of what he saw beyond the threshold, but he began making changes. He widened his door. He added a second stool in his shop. He began teaching others how to build doors that revealed, not concealed. Soon, the village was alive with new architecture. Elms ballooned. Windows sang. Thresholds played music tailored to the person entering. Visitors came from miles around, seeking the town where every door told a story. The bloomwalker left, but her laughter remained. She was last seen riding a goat through an upside-down archway, yelling, "Resilience is just failure with a better outfit." Today, the largest door in Nimblehook stands at the center of town, tall enough for dreams, narrow enough for honesty. Above it reads, "The doorway you feared to open is often the one built for you alone." And inside, the exile's comfort, now called simply home. Title, The Undoing Breath. Year, 194,551,281.8. Era, Early Awakening. Author, Jeremy Levan and Rise of the Zodiac, Series 2025. Chapter 1. The fall of Varnath came not with fire, but with laughter. High above the obsidian palisades of the council's tower, the Harlequin oracle danced, flashes of red and silver trailing behind her like broken starlight. She juggled bones, not to amuse, but to warn. Every motion spelled doom, every grin hid prophecy. Destruction, she sang, is not the end, it is the blueprint's undoing before the next breath is drawn. Below her, the bone-lashed witness limped through the city ruins, dragging a censer of ash. His every step marked testimony. Where his chain-bound arms pointed, truths peeled from the walls like gold paint. He did not speak. He remembered. Together, they were myth-revered and feared. And when the city called for salvation, it was not heroes who came. It was them. Chapter 2. The oracle led the survivors to the mouth of echoes, a rift in the world where sound folded back upon itself and history repeated until heard. There she taught them to listen to one another, to the forgotten, to the fractured songs of those long erased by policy and pride. Children once ignored were given names by their own choosing. Elders were asked questions instead of silenced with comfort. The witness stood at the edge, silent but present, and pointed to the symbols that lingered in shadows, the laws that failed, the architecture that alienated. One morning, the oracle overturned the final statue of the founding lords. Beneath it lay the original plans of Varnath Utopian on parchment, dystopian in practice. She held it aloft. "This," she said, "is what you mourn. Not truth, not people. A failed idea." And then she burned it. No one stopped her. Some wept, but more exhaled. Chapter 3. The council returned those who had fled in ships of silence and gilded armor. They offered order. The oracle offered them masks. "Wear what you've hidden," she said. "Then speak." They refused. So the witness raised his arms, and ash from every forgotten death coalesced in the air, a swirling record of suffering. It did not accuse. It revealed. The people saw, and chose differently. Rather than rebuild the tower, they planted gardens within its foundation. Rather than rewrite the laws, they invited each person to shape one. Children voted first. Justice became not an edifice, but a practice. The oracle left, laughing. The witness vanished into the new soil. Bones left to nourish future blooms, and carved into the last stone of the council's vault were these words: "Destruction is not the end, it is the blueprint's undoing before the next breath is drawn." Varnath did not rise again. Something better did. Title, The One Who Drinks Shadow. Year, 194,230,700. 168.8. Era, Early Awakening. Author, Jeremy Levan, and Rise of the Zodiac, Series 2025. Chapter 1. There was a saying in Beltwig, if the shadow's too quiet, something's about to make noise. It was a kind of village where chickens outnumbered people. Gossip moved faster than the wind, and the wandering monk was both local mystery and part-time high judge. The monk never gave a name. He carried a bell without a clapper, a tea kettle without a handle, and the unnerving habit of laughing before bad news arrived. Most villagers avoided him until their problems needed a touch of oddness, which is exactly why he was summoned when the well began echoing people's thoughts out loud. The baker dropped her biscuits in shame after hearing her own muttered complaint about her mother's ghost. The mayor fell into the cabbage cart upon discovering the well had opinions about tax policies, so naturally they called the monk. He knelt beside the well, whispered a riddle to a thin novice. "This is the work of the one who drinks shadow," he said. The villagers blinked. "Is that a demon?" The monk shrugged. "Or a blessing wearing boots too big." Chapter 2. The one who drinks shadow, as it turned out, wasn't an entity so much as a mood with legs. He wore a coat of smoke, sang lullabies to doors, and drank spilled tea that hadn't been poured with love. He appeared when people avoided their own truths too long, and he never attacked. He just lingered until things cracked. The monk invited him to tea. The villagers were horrified, but curiosity outpaced caution, and soon they gathered around the plaza, where the one sipped shadow from a chipped porcelain cup and asked no questions. The monk said, "He'll leave when you speak what you've been pretending not to know." One by one, villagers approached. The blacksmith admitted he hated hammers. The florist confessed her allergies were fake, she just didn't like weddings. The constable admitted he was afraid of goats. Each confession was met with a chuckle from the one, who grew less dense with each truth and tell. Finally, he became just a man, a quiet one, with very polite shoes. Chapter 3. The monk and the former shadow held a silent duel of teacup gestures for days, some ancient form of philosophical debate no one understood, but everyone enjoyed watching. Then the monk packed his kettle. Before leaving, he tapped the mayor's shoulder. "Next time something strange happens, try stepping back before shouting at it." He looked to the sky. "You are the dream your ancestors dared not speak aloud." And he walked off into a cloud that may have been weather or just timing. The villagers added a new bench by the well. They called it the bench of pausing. When problems seemed too loud, people sat there until their own shadows settled. Above it, a sign now reads, "You are the dream your ancestors dared not speak aloud." And beneath it, a teacup, always warm, never the same flavor twice. Title, The Architecture of Kindness. Year, 193,910,256.2. Era, Early Awakening. Author, Jeremy Levan, and Rise of the Zodiac, Series 2025. Chapter 1. In the fractured reaches of Neok, Virales, where broken towers scraped at the sky and heroes had become enforcers of silence, the new kind of savior stirred one who wore no cape, wore no title, and sought no vengeance. Her name was Myra. They called her the Child of the Void, though she was no child. The name had been whispered since the great rift swallowed the inner circle and returned her silent, glowing, marked with sigils no one could translate. Her power was simple. She made people feel. In a city so used to force, that was the most dangerous gift of all. She passed the barricades, touching abandoned walls and drawing warmth from the concrete. Wherever she walked, old enemies sat beside each other without speaking, then slowly began to share names again. Her kindness was not softness. It was architecture. And in the shadows, watching with guilt and awe, stood Varric the Oathbreaker turned savior. Chapter 2. Varric had once led the Vanguard, a league of powered protectors sworn to uphold the codes of conflict, but he broke his vow when he refused to fire on an unregistered enclave during the uprising of voices. They stripped him of his mantle and cast him beyond the veiled ring. He thought his exile would last forever, until he saw Myra rebuilding what the Vanguard had shattered. No grand speeches, no retribution, just quiet acts, mending walls, healing trauma, listening. One night, she found him watching from a rooftop. "You fear you're still a weapon," she said, not turning. "I was built to be one. And now, I don't know what I am." She smiled. "That's how it begins." He followed her after that, not as protector, as apprentice. Chapter 3. The Council of Remaining Order issued a warrant for Myra's detainment. She did not run. She walked to the gates of the tribunal hall and knocked. Inside, armored figures surrounded her. Varric moved to defend, but she raised a hand. "This city," she said, "is cracked by fear, but fear cannot hold against kindness freely given." They laughed. Then one of them, a junior enforcer, helmet slightly ajar, lowered their baton. "Myra helped my sister walk again." Another dropped their weapon, and another. The leader shouted, but it was too late. The walls did not fall. They unfolded, and kindness became the new order. Later, in the new plaza, where tribunal once stood, Myra carved a single phrase into the first stone bench. Your limits are the architecture of your courage strength. Dirk became guardian of that place, not to fight, but to remind. And Meok, Earlies began to rise again, not with steel, but with care. Title: The Riddle Master. Year: 193,589,743.1. Era: Early Awakening. Author: Jeremy Levan and Rise of the Zodiac Series, 2025. Chapter 1. The ascent ward of Norn's Reach was built like a spiral staircase, each level higher, each citizen prouder, each truth harder to speak. At its base lived the tear catcher. She wandered barefoot, carrying vials no larger than a thumb, collecting tears others were too ashamed to shed. No one knew her name, they only knew her trade. And higher up, in the tower of dual mirrors, lived the Riddle Master. He was not a king, nor a prophet, but something far more dangerous. A questioner. His riddles could slice through belief like a blade through silk. He offered answers only to those who wished asking the real question underneath the one they came with. Their paths crossed on the bridge between wards. The tear catcher had no question. The Riddle Master had no tears, and that was why they noticed each other. He asked her, "Do you know your limit?" She replied, "I don't know how to stop." And he smiled, then frowned, then wept. Chapter 2. Word spread that the Riddle Master had cried. Requests poured in demands for new riddles, for judgment, for clarity. But the man in the tower said nothing. Instead, he sent for the tear catcher. In silence, he offered her a small scroll. One question, only for her. What do you lose when you always try to win? She read it aloud, and across Norn's Reach, walls cracked. Not physically, but mentally, gaps in certainty forming like frosting glass. A merchant gave away his wares. A priest abandoned sermons to listen. A child stopped trying to be brave and asked to be held. The tear catcher walked among them, vials clinking like wind chimes. She didn't explain the riddle. She just witnessed what it uncovered. And still, the Riddle Master wept. He said, "I made this city strong with questions." She said, "You made it brittle with fear of answers." Chapter 3. They ascended together one level at a time. On each tier, she poured out a single vial at the threshold, whispering the story of the tear within. A warrior who couldn't forgive. A mother who chose silence. A scholar who hid behind brilliance. Each level softened. By the time they reached the summit, Norn's Reach no longer spiraled. It opened. The Riddle Master looked out across the city he'd shaped with riddles that dazzled and distanced. He turned to her and whispered, "Then ask me." And she did. Not a riddle. A truth. What would you be without the questions? He broke, then rebuilt. No longer the Riddle Master. Simply a man. He descended with her, step by step. And at the base of the city, they built a new kind of tower, not one of mirrors, but of windows, where questions were still asked, but no longer feared. Etched above its entrance, the hardest truths teach the deepest truths. And beneath that, a shelf of empty vials, waiting for tears that needed catching. Idle. The gift behind resistance. Year: 193,269,230.5. Era: Early Awakening. Author: Jeremy Levan and Rise of the Zodiac Series, 2025. Chapter 1. In the corridors of Kravith's Undercity, where light was rationed and memory carried weight like coin, the name vine-clad prophet was spoken either in reverence or fear. He had once been a botanist, tending synthetic orchards above ground, but after the collapse, he fled below, emerging years later wrapped in roots and whispering truths only the brave dared hear. He claimed the vines showed him what others tried to forget. He was never wrong. The saboteur fate moved in parallel, unseen, but deeply felt. Her work was fire, collapse, reversal. She broke systems to birth new ones. Yet every ruin she left behind bore a small sigil, a twisted leaf marked with blood. The prophet saw them and smiled. "She's not destroying," he said. "She's trying to forgive." They met when the city trembled, fault lines flaring beneath the power grid, panic pulsing through crowded arteries. She was ready to strike again. He was ready to stop her. But instead, they sat, and the vines between them grew. Chapter 2. Her name was Vex, and she had been raised by the mechanist. Order taught that truth lay in control. Order, prediction. That the first time she let chaos and truly let go, she saved the slum from flooding by rerouting the power's surge with nothing but intuition and instinct. She was exiled for it. The prophet listened as she recounted her guilt. "I only destroy," she said. "No," he replied. "You resist, and each resistance you face," he added, "holds a gift only your effort can release." Vex blinked. "What if I don't want the gift? Then someone else receives it," he smiled. "That's what makes it forgiveness." Together, they sought the source of the tremors, an ancient reactor buried beneath the oldest part of the city, still guarded by the Council of Logic. A machine, mind collective, that read them as threats. They answered not with violence, but with vulnerability. They spoke of mistakes, and the system paused. Chapter 3. The Council of Logic issued a directive. Forgiveness is not a function. Error must be corrected. Facts stood firm. Then I am the error. She placed her detonator on the ground. The prophet wrapped his vines around the central core. If healing is not permitted, he said, then you are no longer needed. The vines pulsed, and the council relented. Protocols updated. Control loosened. The machine. Mind stepped back. The tremors ceased. The undercity exhaled. News spread, not of sabotage or prophecy, but of change. Vex and the prophet didn't stay. They walked deeper into the old sectors, seeking other places where resistance still held gifts waiting to be released. And above the old reactor chamber, etched into stone by unseen hands, appeared a final message. Each resistance you face holds a gift only your effort can release. In a city that once feared chaos, forgiveness bloomed like ivy, persistent, patient, and quiet and unstoppable. Idle. The threadless spinner. Year 192,948,717.4. Era Early Awakening. Author Jeremy Levan and Rise of the Zodiac, Series 2025. Chapter 1. The city of Berlin was divided by more than walls. There were the skywalks, bridges suspended over the old city, where the affluent danced through cloud gardens and never touched the ground. And there were the tunnels beneath, where the lights flickered with mood, and law was just a suggestion uttered between breaths. Conflict wasn't new, but silence was. Truths, fragile and unspoken, held the city in an uneasy stillness for 17 years. Neither side acknowledged the other. Neither dared provoke, until the threadless spinner returned. She was once the greatest code breaker in the city, a mediator who used cryptic tapestries to resolve disputes no one could speak aloud. Then she vanished, leaving only empty looms and a final message. You cannot spin peace with borrowed thread. She reappeared in the middle of the high courtyard during the annual Harmony Parade, cloaked in soot, barefoot, smiling, and beside her danced the Harlequin Oracle, figure of myth and mockery, painted in shifting hues, whose riddles cut deeper than any blade. Together, they tossed a ball of invisible yarn between nobles and tunnel dwellers. No one could see it, but everyone felt its pull. Chapter 2. The game began. One by one, citizens from both sides were handed questions. Not shouted, not posted, but whispered through cracked mirrors and overheard dreams. What do you gain from pretending not to need them? What would you lose if they were gone? The answers arrived not in words, but in small changes. A Skywalker child began leaving food by the sewer grate. A tunnel mechanic repaired a broken lift without charging. The city stirred, erupted. Old tensions, long ignored, burst into argument, accusation, even fire. The council blamed the spinner and the oracle, but the spinner only smiled. It had to burn before it could be woven. The harlequin stood atop a fountain and declared, your fears shrink when you walk straight into them. And they did. People began meeting first in secret, and in public, not to debate, to remember. Chapter 3. The council tried to re-establish control with curfews and silence protocols. No one listened. Instead, they gathered at the threadless loom, a symbolic structure built in the plaza where the spinner now lived. It had no thread, no needle, no function. It simply stood, an invitation, to mend what had unraveled. People from both sides began telling stories about lost siblings, hidden kindnesses, regrets. They didn't agree, but they listened. The spinner spun nothing, but from the quiet, understanding began to braid itself. One evening, a woman from the skywalks and a boy from the tunnels danced in the plaza. No music, just footsteps. Just breathe. The oracle wept. The city began to change. Walls were torn down. They were repurposed, turned into murals, into altars, into bridges made not of stone, but of shared memory, of the loom, carved in marble. A single phrase. Your fears shrink when you walk straight into them. The spinner left again, and the oracle. He stayed, to make sure the laughter never left the thread. Title: Where the Light Enters. Year: 192,628,204.9. Era: Early Awakening. Author Jeremy Levan and Rise of the Zodiac, Series 2025. Chapter 1. The border between realms had once pulsed with energy, vibrant, thrumming, vital. Now, it flickered like a dying heartbeat. That was where Kale wandered, known in whispers as the echo of a lost realm. Kale had once crossed from a world now forgotten into one that remembered only loss. He carried nothing but a cracked mirror and a voice that could awaken memory from stone. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words echoed far beyond ears. At the city's edge, where trees grew sideways and shadows stretched in circles, he met Ella, the silent witness. She wore scars like jewelry, each line on her skin an unanswered story. She didn't speak at all. Her vow of silence had lasted 12 years since the collapse since the betrayal, since her heart had learned silence was safer. Yet when she met Cale, something shifted. They sat beside one another for hours without exchange, until he finally said, "Your wounds are secret, they are how the light enters." She didn't answer, but the next morning she returned with a flower Cale had once seen only in dreams. Chapter 2. Ella began to follow Cale through the half-healed riftlands, helping him mark places where memory still slept. They weren't lovers. They weren't strangers. They were something in between held together by unspoken history. In ruins, Cale sang echoes into awakening. In gardens overgrown with grief, Ella cut paths using gestures alone. When they encountered a barrier, an ancient gate powered by forgotten names, Cale tried and failed to open it. Ella stepped forward, pressed her fingers against the stone, and whispered her first word in over a decade. "Mother." The gate melted like wax. Cale caught her before she fell. Later, he whispered, "Trust is not given, it's lived." She nodded. That night, she dreamt of a realm not lost, but waiting. And when she woke, Cale held a sketch he'd made of her hand holding light. Chapter 3. A storm gathered not of weather, but of return. Others who had crossed the veil once lost like Cale began to appear. Each bore marks of what they'd endured. Some had burned bridges. Others had lost names. They feared betrayal. Ella spoke to them, not in many words, but enough. "You are not here to be perfect," she said. "You are here to be seen." Cale sang their fears into the wind, shaping them into songs that turned to lanterns. The realm began to shimmer again. Ella built a shrine of mirrors at the threshold, each one angled to reflect a different scar, a different truth. And on its base, she etched Cale's words. "Your wounds are sacred, they are how the light enters." As the veil lifted, the two did not cross together. Cale stayed to guide others. Ella returned to witness the rebirth of what she thought was lost. But every moon, a single echo crossed the sky, her laughter, soft, free, and Cale smiled. Because sometimes trust builds not a bridge, but a home. Title: The Ghost in Every Cycle. Year: 192,307,691.7. Era: Early Awakening. Author: Jeremy Levan, and Rise of the Zodiac Series 2025. Chapter 1. In the jungle city of Haldren's Loop, everything was built in circles. Houses curved into trees, roads spiraled inward, and decisions were made only after completing the cycle or ritual that required revisiting past grievances before casting any vote. People called it wise. Outsiders called it maddening. But in Haldren, they believed in the ghost. They didn't speak its name, only called it what it was. The reminder. He whispered unresolved truths in moments of stillness, rattled water in bowls, and traced old names into misted windows. Enter the root binder. She came barefoot, cloaked in earth, toned moss, her staff a twisted limb said to have been pulled from the world tree itself. She asked no permission, offered no title, just a question. "Where is your hurt buried?" No one answered, but the jungle shifted, and in the shadows the ghost stirred. Chapter 2. The loop had been quiet for too long. No new votes. Though disputes, only polite silence and forced smiles. But beneath the canopy, strange happenings began. Children spoke of forgotten paths opening. Elders dreamed of moments they'd sworn never to remember. And in the council circle, a name returned. Leorin, the youth once exiled for trying to unite the loop's outer and air clans. They said he died crossing the river, but someone or something had carved his name into every tree along the boundary line. The root finder followed the trail. She found the mask, half buried beneath flowering roots, and beside it, a note: "The longer you flee fear, the more it learns to sprint." She brought it to the council. They asked what she wanted. "I want you to feel what you felt." Chapter 3. A new cycle was initiated, but this one didn't start with debates. It began with silence. Guided by the root finder, citizens entered the jungle one by one, walking the spiral paths of Leorin's final journey. At each marker, they heard echoes of his pleas, his laughter, his last breath beneath the river's roar. No one could complete the journey without weeping, and that was the point. When they returned, the council didn't argue. They apologized, not in policy, but in planting saplings at every border, each one tended by both clans. The loop shifted not in its structure, but in its spirit. Conflict was no longer feared. It was walked through. Together, the ghost stopped whispering, because it had been heard. The root binder left in the night, her path swallowed by moss. Only her staff remained, planted at the cycle's heart. They cited a stone inscription: "The longer you flee fear, the more it learns to sprint." And from that day on, Haldren's Loop was known not for its cycles, but for its courage to complete them. Title: The Altar of Approval. Year: 191,987,179.3. Era: Early Awakening. Author: Jeremy Levan and Rise of the Zodiac Series 2025. Chapter 1. The sky above Crathmore was split in two, half soot, half light, not by weather, but by war. Lines had long dissolved between right and ruin, and in their place rose the Iron Sentinel, a figure of order in a world that forgot what it meant. Forged in exile and trained by a council that no longer ruled, she bore no crown, no title, only a mask of dull steel and the sword she never raised unless mercy demanded it. Her presence calmed riots. Her silence silenced corruption. But civility has enemies. From the edge of fractured history came whispers of one who once knew the Sentinel, someone with the power to unmake her integrity with a single truth. The puzzle-hearted one. The tactician turned poet. A lover turned saboteur. They met on the fields of Fracture Vale, where old machines swept oil into the grass. You cannot serve the sacred, the puzzle said, while bowing to the altar of approval. The Sentinel removed her mask, and finally they spoke as equals. Chapter 2. Chaos hadn't started with bonds or betrayal. It had started when leaders stopped listening, when their ears turned toward applause and away from me. The Iron Sentinel had once been part of that system. She enforced rules because they were written. She sentenced the puzzle-hearted one to silence when their code poems exposed guffor, mental deceit, and yet she had read every word. Now they walked together, one armored, one vulnerable, one cold, one alive with riddles. They toured shattered towns not to restore command, but to ask, what would serve you now? Villagers answered with murals, with songs, with tears. Every answer reshaped the Sentinel's creed. When they arrived at the citadel and echoed orders, the old guard stood ready, banners raised, voices tight with protocol. You have abandoned command, they declared. No, the Sentinel replied. I have remembered its purpose. She laid her sword on the ground, and the puzzle spoke. Chapter 3. Their speech was not incendiary. It was intimate. They told of betrayal, yes, but also of hope, of systems that devoured their creators, and people who forgot they could write new systems from scratch. I was punished, they said, because I refused to reduce truth to silence. And I, the Sentinel added, because I mistook silence for peace. Together, they proposed a shift. Leadership would rotate. Councils would include children. Mistakes would be not erased, but recorded in a book called the Living Scroll. Some guards stepped down. Others wept. A few refused, but they were not exiled. They were invited to rest. A city without rulers emerged, not chaotic, but conversational. And above its gates, etched into weathered iron, the people engraved, you cannot serve the sacred while bowing to the altar of approval. The Sentinel removed her mask forever. The puzzle-hearted one folded the last riddle into a song, and Crathmore stood not in conquest, but in consent.